They won. After 1,271 days, after 80,000 dead, after enough silver to fund a dozen wars, the greatest empire on earth walked through the gates of Ostend on September 20th, 1604, and received a pile of rubble. No buildings, no streets, no harbor, just sand, debris, and the silence of a place that had been fought over so long and so savagely that nothing was left worth fighting for. One Spanish officer walked through the ruins and said nothing for a long time. What was there to say? Spain had committed the full weight of its empire, its treasury, its armies, its prestige, to capturing one small coastal town, a sandbar on the Flemish coast. No great fortress, no irreplaceable port, just a town that pride said could not be left standing. They won it, and it cost them everything. This is not a story about a siege. This is a story about what happens when an empire cannot admit a mistake and keeps paying in blood and silver long after every rational voice has gone quiet. Welcome to the Clash of Ancients. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, new battle every week. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Here is what most accounts of Ostend get wrong. They frame it as a military story, a siege, a defense, an eventual surrender. They count the days and the casualties and declare Spain the victor and move on. They treat Ostend as an episode in the 80 Years' War rather than what it actually was. The moment the Spanish Empire began to reveal the crack that would eventually split it apart. Ostend was not a battle Spain lost. It was a victory that cost more than any defeat. To understand how that is possible, you need to understand what Spain was in 1601. The Spanish Empire at the opening of the 17th century was the closest thing the world had ever seen to a global superpower. It controlled the Americas from Mexico to Patagonia, and with them, the silver mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, producing quantities of precious metal that had no precedent in human history. It controlled the Philippines, the southern Italian states, Portugal and its overseas empire, and the Spanish Netherlands, the wealthy, urbanized, heavily populated region of modern Belgium, and the southern Netherlands that was the most economically productive territory in Europe. It had defeated the Ottoman fleet at Lepanto in 1571. It had conquered the Aztec and Inca empires within living memory. Its armies, the tercios, the most feared infantry formations in the world, had fought across 3 continents and lost almost nothing. And for 30 years it had been trying to suppress a rebellion in the northern provinces of the Netherlands. The Dutch revolt had begun in 1568. A collection of Protestant provinces refusing to accept Spanish religious and political authority, refusing to be governed by a Catholic empire that regarded their faith as heresy. What had begun as a provincial uprising had, by 1601, become something else entirely. The Dutch Republic, a functioning state with its own government, its own army under the brilliant Maurice of Nassau, its own rapidly expanding commercial empire, and the financial resources to sustain a war indefinitely. Spain had been trying to crush this republic for 30 years. It had not worked. Into this stalemate, so Ostend entered the story. Ostend was a small coastal town on the Flemish coast, one of the few towns in the Spanish Netherlands still held by the Dutch Republic, a Protestant enclave sitting inside Spanish-controlled territory like a splinter under skin. Archduke Albert of Austria, Governor-General of the Spanish Netherlands and son-in-law of Philip II, looked at Ostend in the summer of 1601 and made a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. He would take it, quickly, cleanly. A demonstration of Spanish power that would demoralize the Dutch and show the watching courts of Europe that the empire was still capable of decisive action. It would take weeks, he believed. He was wrong by approximately 3 years and 2 months. The siege began on July 5th, 1601, with what appeared to be overwhelming force. Archduke Albert committed approximately 20,000 soldiers to the initial investment of Ostend, more than enough by any conventional military calculation, to reduce a small coastal town held by a garrison of roughly 5,000 defenders. The mathematics were simple. The outcome seemed predetermined. The ground had other ideas. Ostend was built on the Flemish coast, which means it was built on sand, surrounded by tidal flats, intersected by drainage channels, and subject to the constant intervention of the North Sea. Every trench the Spanish dug filled with water. Every earthwork they raised subsided overnight. The fortifications they spent weeks constructing would be undermined by a single high tide. The terrain that looked like a military asset, flat, open, offering no natural cover to the defenders, was in fact a natural fortress of the worst possible kind, one that actively resisted the attackers' engineering while providing the defenders with an endless supply of the one thing that matters most in a siege: time. The Dutch garrison inside Ostend understood something the Spanish commanders outside it had not yet grasped. They did not need to defeat the Spanish army. They only needed to survive long enough for the siege to become too expensive to continue. And survival in Ostend was a matter of engineering, resupply, and the willingness to absorb punishment indefinitely. Maurice of Nassau, the Dutch Republic's military commander, watching from a careful distance, understood this even more clearly. He did not attempt a full military relief of Ostend. He did something more valuable. He kept the sea lanes open. Dutch supply ships ran the Spanish blockade with remarkable regularity, delivering food, ammunition, replacement soldiers, and, critically, replacement commanders when the previous ones were killed. Ostend did not have a garrison. It had a rotating institution, continuously replenished, continuously functioning, continuously refusing to die. The Spanish commanders on the ground grew desperate, then furious, then were replaced. Francisco de Mendoza, the initial Spanish commander, tried direct assault after direct assault. Each one failed. The flooded terrain robbed his tercios of the disciplined formation that made them invincible on conventional battlefields. Men drowned in siege trenches before they reached the walls. Disease, typhus, dysentery, the inevitable consequence of thousands of men living in waterlogged ground, killed more soldiers than Dutch muskets. Mendoza was replaced in humiliation. His successors fared no better. By 1602, 1 full year into the siege, Spain had committed approximately 40,000 soldiers to Ostend. Roughly half of them were dead. The town had not fallen. The garrison had been resupplied multiple times. And in Madrid, Philip III's treasury was beginning to register the pressure of a siege that had been budgeted for weeks and was now running into its second year with no end visible. Here is the trap that Ostend had become by 1602, and this is the part that no military calculation had anticipated. Spain could not leave. Not because leaving was militarily impossible. Leaving was always possible. They could have lifted the siege on any given morning, marched their armies elsewhere, and redirected their resources to more productive operations. Militarily, abandoning Ostend was an entirely viable option, but politically, imperially, it was unthinkable. The Siege of Ostend had become, in the courts and pamphlets of Europe, the defining test of Spanish power. Every Catholic monarch was watching, every Protestant state was watching, the Dutch Republic was watching. Abandoning the siege would not merely mean failing to take a small coastal town. It would mean announcing to every watching power that the Spanish Empire, the most formidable military machine in the world, had been defeated by a sandbar. The prestige cost of leaving exceeded the financial cost of staying. And so Spain stayed, and paid, and died, and stayed some more. By 1603, the siege had consumed an estimated 60,000 Spanish and Allied soldiers. The financial drain was reaching figures that Madrid's accountants were struggling to calculate without despair. The silver from the Americas, the lifeblood of Spanish imperial finance, was being poured into Flemish sand at a rate that threatened to destabilize the entire imperial economy. Philip III made one decision that would finally change the equation. He sent Ambrogio Spinola. Spinola was not a soldier by original profession. He was a Genoese banker from one of the great merchant banking families of Italy, a man whose understanding of money, logistics, and long-term planning had been formed in counting houses rather than military academies. He was also, as it turned out, a military genius of the first order, and he arrived at Ostend with a simple, brutal assessment of what the siege required. Not heroism, not assault, not the furious direct attacks that had killed 60,000 men and accomplished nothing. Patience, engineering, systematic, methodical strangulation, cutting Ostend off from resupply, tightening the blockade by land and sea simultaneously, advancing the siege lines inch by inch rather than yard by yard, accepting that this would take another year rather than another week. Spinola was right, and he was also, so in a way that the story does not often acknowledge, paying for this privilege with his own money. When Spanish funds ran short, and they did repeatedly, Spinola drew on his family's personal fortune to keep his army in the field. The banker who had come to end the siege was literally investing his own capital in the venture, which meant that when Ostend finally fell, he had won a military victory and lost a personal fortune simultaneously. The final months of the siege were the worst. The garrison inside Ostend, resupplied less reliably as Spinola tightened the blockade, fought with the particular ferocity of men who understood that relief was no longer coming. The Dutch Republic, making its own cold strategic calculation, had decided that Ostend had served its purpose. The drain on Spain was done. Further sacrifice to hold a ruined town was no longer rational. The garrison was on its own. On September 20th, 1604, after 1,271 days, the garrison of Ostend surrendered on terms, marching out with honors of war, flags flying, drums beating, as was the custom for defenders who had resisted with distinction. They marched out of a town that no longer existed, and the Spanish army marched in. The night of September 19th, 1604, the last night of the siege, was quiet in a way that 1,270 nights before it had not been. Inside the ruins of Ostend, the garrison prepared to leave. These were not the same men who had begun the defense 3 years earlier. Almost none of those men were alive. This was the latest rotation of a garrison that had been replenished and replenished and replenished until replenishment stopped. They were professional soldiers, English, Dutch, Scottish, French, who had signed on for pay and found themselves participants in something that had grown, while they were inside it, into a legend. They packed what they had, which was not much. 3 years of siege had reduced personal possessions to the category of things you could carry in your hands. One English soldier, whose name is not recorded, reportedly spent the last evening walking the ruins of what had once been Ostend's main street. Not out of sentiment. There was nothing sentimental left in a man who had survived 3 years in those conditions. Perhaps simply to see what they were leaving, what it had cost. Outside the walls in the Spanish camp, there was no celebration. Spinola's soldiers were professionals, the tercios, the finest infantry in the world, and they had been in front of these walls for over a year. They knew what was inside. They had seen the supply ships that no longer came. They had watched the town's profile, visible above the battered walls, change from a silhouette of buildings to a silhouette of rubble. They knew that what they were receiving in the morning was not a prize. Spinola himself, by the accounts that survive, spent the evening with his logistics officers, calculating already the cost of what would need to be done next. The siege was ending. The war was not. And his own family's fortune poured into the last year of this operation was not coming back regardless of what tomorrow brought. Two armies, one ending a defense that had made them famous across Europe, one ending a siege that had cost their empire more than anyone had intended to pay. Neither side felt like a winner. Stop for a moment. Before we talk about what the fall of Ostend meant strategically for Spain, for the Dutch Republic, for the balance of European power, remember what it meant for the men who were actually there. Over 100,000 soldiers died at Ostend. Most of them did not die in heroic charges or dramatic last stands. They died of typhus in waterlogged trenches. They drowned in flooded siege works. They died of infected wounds that would have been survivable anywhere other than a besieged coastal town with no medical supplies. They died because two sides had decided that this particular sandbar on the Flemish coast was worth dying for. Was it? I am not sure either side ever answered that question honestly. The surrender of Ostend on September 20th, 1604 was, by the formal standards of 17th century warfare, a Spanish victory. The flags came down, the garrison marched out, Spinola's tercios marched in. The military transaction was completed with the appropriate ceremony. Honors of war observed, terms respected, the formal rituals of early modern siege warfare performed correctly by both sides. And then the Spanish soldiers looked at what they had won. The town of Ostend, the town they had spent 1,271 days trying to capture, did not exist in any meaningful sense. The buildings were gone, demolished either by Spanish bombardment or by the defenders themselves, using the rubble to reinforce their positions. The streets were indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The harbor, such as it had been, was choked with debris and deliberately obstructed. The fortifications that had resisted 3 years of assault were not even intact fortifications anymore. They were the accumulated earthworks and sandbag revetments and improvised walls of a garrison that had been rebuilding its own defenses continuously for over 3 years. What Spinola received was sand, rubble, the ghost of a town. Contemporary accounts from both sides agree on this with unusual consistency. The victors and the defeated, the Spanish chroniclers and the Dutch pamphleteers, all described the same scene. One Spanish officer wrote that the town they had taken could not be sold for what a single day of the siege had cost. An English observer, writing from The Hague, noted that Spain had purchased the most expensive ruin in European history. But the physical reality of the ruins, devastating as it was, is not the real story of what Spain had won and lost at Ostend. The real story is in the numbers. 80,000 dead, the consolidated estimate across the siege's full duration, combining Spanish, Allied, Dutch, English, and Scottish casualties. 60,000 of those on the Spanish side alone, by the most conservative accounting. 300 million ducats expended, a figure so large that contemporary Spanish treasury officials could not easily contextualize it, because it exceeded several years of the total silver output of the American mines. And what had Spain received for this expenditure? A ruined town of no strategic importance that required complete reconstruction before it could serve any military or commercial purpose. A 3-year demonstration of Dutch resilience that had been watched by every court in Europe and had conclusively established that the Dutch Republic could not be broken by conventional siege warfare, regardless of the resources committed. a treasury so strained that Philip III would be forced into financial restructuring within years, and an army, the famous tercios, the finest infantry in the world, that had been fed into the Flemish mud for 3 years and had emerged diminished, not in courage or skill, but in numbers and in the institutional confidence that comes from winning. Meanwhile, Maurice of Nassau had spent those same 3 years doing something entirely different. While Spain poured its resources into Ostend, Maurice had been systematically capturing other towns across the northern Netherlands: Rijnberg, Meur, Grave, Sluis. He had been expanding Dutch territory, consolidating Dutch political authority, and building the commercial and military infrastructure of a republic that was, by 1604, a functioning great power rather than a rebellious province. The Dutch East India Company had been founded in 1602, while the siege was still grinding on, establishing the commercial empire that would make the Dutch Republic the dominant trading power of the 17th century. Spain had been staring at Ostend. The Dutch Republic had been building the future. This is the strategic reality that the siege's outcome obscures. Ostend was a Dutch defeat that functioned as a Dutch victory. The garrison had tied down Spanish resources in men, money, and strategic attention for 3 years at a cost Spain could not ultimately absorb. The town fell. The strategy succeeded. And there is one more layer of complexity that the straightforward military account leaves out. The men who defended Ostend, celebrated across Protestant Europe as heroes, commemorated in pamphlets and sermons and popular songs, were, in a significant sense, being used. Maurice of Nassau had made a cold calculation. The drain on Spain that Ostend produced was worth more than the cost of a military relief operation that might have saved the garrison sooner. He kept the sea lanes open long enough to keep the siege going. He did not commit to a full relief because a full relief would have ended the siege, and ending the siege would have freed Spanish resources for other operations. The men who died in those flooded trenches, defending a town that their own commander had decided was more valuable as a drain than as a position. They were not abandoned. But they were, in the language of strategic calculation, expendable. History calls them heroes. History is not wrong. Both things are true simultaneously, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about Ostend. Spain rebuilt Ostend, slowly, expensively, without enthusiasm. The town that had cost 80,000 lives and 300 million ducats was reconstructed as a functioning port and garrison town. Useful, eventually, in a modest way, contributing to Spanish military logistics in the southern Netherlands in the years that followed. It was never worth what it had cost. It could not have been. No town on earth could have been worth what Ostend cost Spain. The 80 Years' War continued for another 44 years after Ostend, finally ending with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. The republic that Spain had been trying to suppress since 1568, that had survived every military effort to destroy it, that had used the Siege of Ostend as a weapon against the empire besieging it. That republic was recognized in 1648 as a sovereign state. Spain lost the war it had been fighting when it laid siege to Ostend. Ambrogio Spinola, the man who had finally taken the town, who had invested his family fortune in the siege, who had demonstrated a military genius that few of his contemporaries could match, went on to further campaigns in the Spanish Netherlands and eventually died in 1630, still serving the Spanish crown, still trying to suppress a rebellion that could not be suppressed. His personal finances never fully recovered from what he had spent at Ostend. The Spanish Empire continued its long decline through the 17th century, not because of Ostend alone, but because of the pattern that Ostend represented. The inability to cut losses, the prioritization of prestige over strategic rationality, the willingness to spend irreplaceable resources on objectives that pride demanded and reason questioned. Philip III died in 1621, having never resolved the financial pressures that Ostend had helped create. The Cold Open asked, "At what point does the cost of winning become indistinguishable from losing?" Ostend's answer is architectural. It is written in the rubble that Spanish soldiers walked through on September 20th, 1604, looking for the town they had paid 80,000 lives to enter. The cost of winning was everything. The value of what they won was nothing. And the empire that could not see the difference between those two numbers could not walk away when walking away was still possible. That empire was already carrying the weight that would eventually bring it down. Not at Ostend, not yet. But the pattern was established. The habit was confirmed, and habits, in empires as in men, are far easier to continue than to break. Ostend did not destroy the Spanish Empire. It showed the Spanish Empire how it would eventually be destroyed. Slowly, expensively, one siege at a time, paying full price for rubble and calling it victory, and doing it again. Ostend is remembered, where it is remembered at all, as a footnote in the 80 Years' War. A long siege, so a Spanish victory, a detail in the larger story of Dutch independence. The history books move past it quickly, toward Westphalia and the formal end of the conflict. But the Siege of Ostend is not a footnote. It is a case study in the most dangerous trap an empire can fall into, the point where the cost of continuing exceeds the value of the objective, but the cost of stopping exceeds what pride can bear. The point where rational calculation has long since given its verdict, and the only thing still driving the decision is the weight of everything already spent. Sunk cost. It destroyed 80,000 lives. It drained a treasury. It helped unravel an empire. When you imagine yourself as Philip III's closest advisor in 1602, 1 year in, 40,000 men dead, no end in sight, do you walk into that room and tell the king to stop? Knowing what it will cost him to hear it, knowing what it will cost you to say it. And do you know honestly what you would do? If you watched this far, you're exactly who this channel is made for. Share this with one person who loves history. That's all I ask. If this video made you think, subscribe to The Clash of Ancients. We cover the wars that shaped the world. Share it with someone who thinks history is just dates and battles. And drop a comment. Was Spain's decision to keep the siege going after the first year a catastrophic failure of strategic judgment? Or was walking away simply impossible once the empire had committed its prestige? I want to know what you think. This has been The Clash of Ancients. Some fields remember what was done on them longer than the men who did it, and I will see you in the next one.